Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? How come in Galaxy Storm's seminal hit, Johnny Tar, they say in the middle of a morning and a dark and stormy night? I've just figured out why, because it is a dark and stormy night for two of us here in New Zealand, but it's the middle of the morning for another person. That's never happened to me before. I'm so excited about it. I had to share. Thank you all for listening to my random diatribe. The rest of this podcast is about open source. I am, of course, your host, Richard Littauer. Hi, everyone. The weird one. And then we have my co-host here today, Eriol Fox, calling in from Britain. Eriol, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm also a little weird as well, though, so don't take all the credit for yourself.
That's a fair point. Eriol is doing weird. And our guest is incredibly normal. Joining us today from Wellington as well, which is really cool. We have Kade Morton. Kade, how are you doing?
Lovely to be here.
Lovely to have you. It's really exciting to be able to talk to a fellow Kiwi, even though I'm obviously American. I've moved to New Zealand. It's just nice to do that. So this is one of the podcasts that we have going for Maintainer Month, which is a month of May, where we basically talk about how maintainers are the best and how they're awesome and what it's like to be a maintainer in today's world. Thank you, GitHub, for the funding money to have these podcasts. And thank you for connecting us to Kade. Now, Kade Morton, you are intense. And I use the word intense because anyone who does cybersecurity has to be intense. It's such a weird niche field that I know little about, but I'm always scared. So can you tell me, did you break my laptop plug before coming on this podcast? And how did you do it? And if not, what do you actually do with your time in cybersecurity?
I swear I did not break your plug. What I do with my time in cybersecurity, I'm split between a day job and a startup at the moment. So my day job is working in a security operations center for a utilities. I've worked in a couple of different SOCs, so security operations centers. And the startup that I run is called Arachne Digital. We provide threat intelligence and we specialize around threat-informed defense, which we can sort of get into a little bit later.
That sounds really, really cool. So before starting Arachne, you were also around before. You contributed to projects like Alethea, which is a decentralized platform for scientific publications, which is really close to my heart. And you've also been a mentor on Mozilla's Open Leaders program. Did Abby drag you into that?
Yes.
That makes sense. Abby is awesome. Hello, Abby, wherever you are.
Abby is amazing.
One of my first questions I always have to ask about people working in cybersecurity, and I'm sorry to pigeonhole you, is if that's the only thing I know of. It's the only hole I have, and I see a giant pigeon in it. How did you get started as a maintainer in that field? Were you just like building websites and one day tried to break another person's website? Or what happened?
I guess it's a long story as far as how I got into cybersecurity and then looking at how I became a maintainer. Long story short, I didn't have a computer science background. I went to university, studied criminology. I was very, very interested around these ideas of crime and international relations. So I had international relations as one of my majors. I wasn't entirely sure exactly sort of like how to actually sort of use it. And then cybersecurity started to become a lot more mainstream, where we started to see headlines around different groups. So this was sort of like, I guess, coming into 2016. So we were looking at a lot of the Russian interference in the US election at the time. And that's when I started to see, my interest in international relations, geopolitics, my interest in crime was sort of coming together as far as this cybersecurity niche. So at that point, I started to self-teach myself. I really wanted to get into this field. And it was at that point that I started to interact with a lot of open source projects, like installing various Linux distributions to start learning sort of like the ins and outs of how an operating system that's not Windows actually functions. From there, I had a lot of interest as far as looking at, okay, so we've got these real big projects. So you have like Linux distributions, a lot of security tools are open source, and some of them like have long-standing projects with a lot of maintainers, and looking at how do these groups function? Because these groups are very different than what we would normally think of in a very sort of like Western hierarchical sense, where a lot of these groups are decentralized. A lot of these groups, volunteers are people that are donating their time. And that's not really what we often think of as far as like, we go to school, there's someone above us as a teacher, like we are told what to do. We then go into the workforce, there's someone above us and we are told what to do. These ideas of like people going out and just building things and you can download this stuff for free, it just seemed almost too good to be true. And I wanted to understand how this ecosystem works. From there, it was a case of starting to get involved with Mozilla. And then I started to look at some open source projects and then started to sort of get involved in like some stuff that I had actually started to build myself. And then eventually I ended up starting my company, Arachne Digital.
So you mentioned that you became a maintainer. What sort of projects do you maintain?
So coming into being a maintainer myself, for Arachne Digital, we have a couple of different projects I'm the maintainer across. Our main project is Thread. So Thread is a open source project that's forked from Tram, and that's put out by a group called MITRE in the United States. We've taken that, forked it, and started to improve some functionality around it. So I, along with a developer, go through and shape up the tickets. I look at the design. I'm the end user as far as processing intelligence. That is what sort of the Thread is, its main function is. So as the end user, I'm sort of going through and sort of defining like what this needs to have as far as new functionality, new different bits and pieces that it can do. And I work with our developer to basically maintain all that.
I love your story of how you came into open source, particularly because you are not computer science background. And I personally think it's so important that people that are not from a computer science, technology, however you kind of want to slice it, background, come into open source, because as you say about the work that you're doing on Thread, you are the end user. You are the people that, for sustainability or other reasons, adoption of these kinds of tools, participation in these kinds of tools is really important. And I'm wondering, from your experience and background across criminology, across political geopolitics, you said, how do you find speaking to people in the open source space, maybe from computer science backgrounds, maybe from other backgrounds, about the importance of better cybersecurity tools, better security tools, more usable security tools? And how do they engage with the geopolitical, or the, I guess what you could say, the slightly difficult parts of like human life and how it intersects with technology? What have the conversations been like?
Yeah, I guess there's a few different pieces of that. So I'll try to approach them one at a time. As far as approaching groups and getting them to be invested in better tools, it's actually like quite a difficult conversation. It's, I guess, very interesting as far as I came into a lot of my open source work through Mozilla. Mozilla was a bit of a gateway for me. Again, shout out to Abby. Abby is amazing. And when you're in those spaces, most people will understand open source pretty well. And you can sort of have a lot of conversations around what the importance is and why we should be contributing to this shared asset that we all have access to. Stepping out of those spaces, and particularly in the corporate world, it is a little bit more hard as far as like people are just not as schooled in how these projects work, the nuances around why they're important. So those conversations can be relatively difficult. If you're looking at like trying to get people involved, I think what a lot of it comes down to, and getting to sort of understand the buy-in, there's a lot of proprietary tools out there. And I think we need to shape it up in the sense that that is how the ecosystem can go. And there's a lot of positive things as far as the great things that some organizations can put out, but there's a lot of negatives that go along with that as well. And understanding that we can have a shared resource that people have access to, they can audit, they can have some level of trust in it, they can have some level of agency around it, they can be a part of it. These are really important things. And I think that while these conversations can be difficult to bring people on that journey, I think we are getting to a point where people are looking around. We are seeing headline after headline around various closed source tools that people are quite often using, saying that, oh, actually data is being siphoned away and it's going to like places you don't know. It's being put towards uses that you're not aware of. Like we're seeing day in, day out, surveillance capitalism being played out through the tech sphere. And so I think people are looking around and looking at, well, how could this be another way? Like, are there things that we could be doing? And there definitely is, but it's getting them to be a part of those conversations. Then there was, I guess, the follow-up question. I guess in open source communities, often people will want to embrace those discussions. It's normally when you are in other spaces, as far as like the corporate world, that people are like much more reticent for various reasons. And that's, I guess, one of the nicer things about a lot of these open source spaces. You can run into this idea of, well, I'm just a technical person. I just want to code. I don't want to sort of think about some of the externalities around all of this. particularly what I look at in threat intelligence. So like cyber threat intelligence is a very niche subset of cybersecurity writ large. And what we do is we collect information on hackers. We provide that information to people so they can make decisions around how to like structure their defenses or how they can defend themselves. There's lots of ways you can go about it. You can get really technical about it, but at the end of the day, it's providing advice to people so they can make informed decisions is really like what it actually gets down to. And a lot of the stuff that we are collecting is coming from places like China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, this kind of stuff. And you don't need to be long in cybersecurity to start hearing about like nation state hackers and that kind of stuff. Those are not necessarily the be all and end all of what you want to worry about, but they are a subset of what is out there. And it is worth understanding that. When you start looking at who is exploiting various vulnerabilities, who is going about and committing ransomware, who is going about and stealing cryptocurrency for various things, even some more of that crime element. And you can then start to look at more of the like geopolitical element as far as like stealing government secrets for various means. It doesn't take long to understand that you are going to have some, at least, acknowledgement that this is part of what you do. Like, I feel it's very, very wrapped up in if you're in these spaces, you can try to be quite closed off and say, well, I only deal with like these very sort of like technical attacks and I don't think about who commits them. Personally, I think that misses a huge part of the piece. There's someone sitting behind a keyboard at the end of the day that's doing this. The computer didn't go and do stuff itself. Someone did this, and you need to understand where they come from, what worldview they have, like what culture they grew up in, what news are they consuming that is making them either want to do this, or what system do they live under that they feel they are compelled or like they are part of it and they have to do this kind of stuff. There's so much that goes into that. And I think it becomes quite clear being in security that you do start to see that. And I know some people can be closed off. I hope that more people will take the idea that like we should not lose sight of the person behind the keyboard when we are thinking about these security concepts.
So I'm relatively naive. Wouldn't it be easier to run a cybersecurity consultancy using closed source tools? Because open source tools are easy for hackers to target you and know what you're using and be like, well, I'm just not going to attack that vector then.
You would think so. It does not necessarily play out that way. In open source, we have this idea of the many eyes theory that makes bugs shallow. I personally don't necessarily buy 100% into that idea because I do think that open source does struggle a little bit as far as getting those eyes to find those bugs. However, the code is open and stuff is there. So there is that functionality to be able to surface these bugs and get them looked at. So there is an argument to be made around open source tools being more secure in that sense. I do think there is a worthy discussion around sort of the asymmetry of having a large corporation with lots of money and a large dev team that can sort of work through that kind of stuff compared to an open project where you can see the code base, but they don't have a lot of maintainers. They are struggling to sort of get people to audit their code. It's a worthy discussion, but open code, it is worth knowing that is, I think, a good thing. But when you also look at, okay, so the vulnerabilities that are actually being exploited out in the wild, if you're like, well, why do we just have like proprietary software and just sort of like run ourselves that way? It's mostly proprietary software that's being hacked. We see, particularly in this space, there's lots of stuff as far as like perimeter devices. So you have some big brands. I probably won't name specific brands just for the sake of things, but you have boundary devices as far as like firewalls, routers, VPNs, this kind of stuff. A lot of the code base for this stuff is quite old. It's closed. No one's really gone through it. There's lots of bugs in there. And it's very easy for people to find this stuff. And because these are big corporations, they have an install base all across the world. When you find one vulnerability in an install base across the world, you now have a vulnerability across the world. And that is unfortunately how this plays out, even though they have very large budgets with large dev teams. So I wouldn't say like just use open source or just use proprietary products. I think there's a worthy discussion around what products you want to use that sort of fit your need. But I do think it's worth noting that you can't just say, oh, well, we just use proprietary stuff and it's safe because there's a big security team sitting behind it. There may be a big security team sitting behind it. It does not mean that things are necessarily being surfaced and being patched in a timely manner. Unfortunately, we have seen that that is not the case for quite some time now. Really
fascinating to hear and compare against some of my stories. from when I've done similar-ish things. And I remember there was a tool that I was working on, and they wanted to introduce safe ways of doing signatures on documents. And they were having this discussion between, should we use a proprietary tool for our signature collection on documents, or should we consider building and using an open source tool to collect signatures? And there was very much like this nervousness between, well, proprietary has to be safer because there's a customer support team and there's like people that can help us if something goes wrong, and open source doesn't have that. And there was this real like tension between like perceived level of security and like quote unquote professionalism, corporations and things like that. I'm wondering about some of the other kinds of humans involved in this kind of work. So a little bit ago, you mentioned human rights activists and maybe people that are on some of the less access to technical tools and systems. I'm wondering if you have any like experience or like ways of sustaining tools that are for people that are doing the good activism out there, or the activism, and what your experiences around like security and open source for those kinds of individual actors can be.
I guess the first thing to point out, as far as if people are human rights activists or sort of like they're in that field, as far as they generally advocating for something that is seen to be a common good for a lot of people, but there is a very powerful vested interest party that does not like it. People in that space will generally have a very particular threat model. And when we say threat model, what we're talking about is who would be targeting you and then how they would go about doing it. Generally, if you're talking about human rights activists, your threat model will start to include some of your higher end, we call them like cyber threat actors, CTAs. We use lots of acronyms in this space, but basically threat actors are just, again, people behind keyboards, they are hackers. It gets pretty gnarly in the human rights space because you unfortunately have this perfect storm of human rights often don't have a lot of money to be spending on things. And you can sometimes find yourself up against some of the best and brightest, some of the worst regimes in the world can put up against you. It's a very, very difficult one. Activists will often sort of tend more towards these open source projects because they have a little bit more understanding as far as we can see the code base. They will often default to this kind of stuff because it's free. It's just a little bit more easier and accessible for them. Again, I won't sort of like name specific projects, but there's like some very sort of like big open source projects that lots of human rights groups will sort of like rally towards, particularly in the security space. It's a real hard one. So personally, what we have tried to do is, as part of sustaining the open source projects that Arachne Digital runs, we've wrapped a business model around it to try to bring in money to sort of continue that development work. But we still want to recognize that we want to be helping groups that we feel are doing very good work around human rights. So one of the things that my business partner and I have actually sort of built into our organization is that we've said that like on a case-by-case basis, like we want to make sure that the system is not being gamed. But if people come to us and they fall into a certain category and we have human rights allocated out as one of those categories, we will give them access to so the base level of our services, which will be sort of like basic advice around like the different threat actors that are targeting you and then what to do about them. We provide that for free. No strings attached. As long as we can see there's a good human rights case for that, we will give them like the base tier of our services for free. And just that's that. That's one of the things that we've tried to do to try to like contribute to this space. But it's a very difficult one in the sense that these big businesses that are sort of like pushing security tools, they go where the money is. And often the money is not in particularly like your smaller human rights organizations. So supporting them is hard. I don't have a silver bullet, and I don't know how you sort of fix this asymmetry of, unfortunately, small security budgets versus a very gnarly threat model. We're trying to do our part, but yeah, it's a hard one.
So I used to run a company called Maintainer Mountaineer, which I haven't really done much with for a while. And my main goal was to build a way of showing that your open source community that your business is having can employ people or can have community members that can then become employees. And so you're saving time on HR and hiring because you hire someone who already knows how to work with the code that you're putting out there. It's a pretty easy way of making money. You say, listen, you're going to save money by not having to hire new devs. You can hire devs who are already experienced and save that whole on-ramp. Now, that's just like one part of a budget. Another part of a budget a lot of sustaining open source type people use is it's difficult to use this software. We'll teach you how to run it. That's like the Red Hat model, right? You can install Linux all you want. Go ahead, have fun. Read the man docs. We haven't updated them. But we can come in and we can update them for you, right? We can go and we can install this rack. And that's fine. That also works. It seems like you have this other model, which is like, yeah, remember when you got ransomware last year? That really sucked for you. We'll try to make that not happen again. And I would imagine that you're trying to hit the sweet spot of give us this amount of money and that amount of money won't happen, or that amount of risk won't happen. So you try to scare them and then take a bit. Does that sound right as like your marketing strategy as a security open source shop?
More or less, there is some nuance there. I will generally just try to steer away from the idea of scaring people. We generally look down upon people that we think that are like sort of just drumming up here for the sake of drumming up here. But I think it is worth like having a healthy respect for what's out there and having a good understanding for what's out there. That's not synonymous with fear, but that is just being smart. That is just being intelligent, as far as there are real risks that an organization should be aware of. Be they a small human rights organization, like right through up to a Fortune 500, Fortune 100 company. So understanding that risk and being able to articulate what that risk is in a balanced way is definitely what we look at as far as the business model for like a general security company. What we do is, again, we provide intelligence to give people advice on sort of how they can go and fix their problems themselves. We are looking at stuff as far as the various sort of companies that have sort of wrapped business models around like different Linux distributions as far as like managing stuff yourself. We have a managed instance of some of the open source software that we have. So like we actually have like thread instances that we manage ourselves. And that's public and people can use that. But that's not necessarily sort of where we're at least making money at this stage. There could be some stuff we look at down the track as we sort of figure out sort of further ways to sustain ourselves. But at the moment, we use open source tools to create a product that we are going through and selling. It's not software as a service as far as sort of like the model of like hosting it and then sort of like having someone come in and use it themselves. We are sort of generating a product in that sense.
Cool. Okay, that makes sense. So it's a mixture of models. I'm glad Eriol asked about the best people in the world doing the hardest thing, the people out there working for aid, charities, all the good stuff. They're important. But at the end of the day, cash cows normally are found in other fields. And so when I think about major security risks, I think about governments that are chronically underfunded by their people and budgets are slashed all the time. And I think about Fortune 500s, which have huge amounts of money, but don't want to spend it because capitalism is greedy. I don't know of another way of putting that, but generally you don't want to spend the money that you've earned. And so you're always trying to play off there. Do you find that you're getting a better amount of customers from one area or one sector or the other for this sort of work?
So I will say it is early days for us in the sense that we are trying to promote both this idea of sort of like how you use threat intelligence and this idea of threat-informed defense. Threat-informed defense, basically the theory around it is saying that if you understand your threat model as far as who is going to be targeting your industry and your geography, so wherever that happens to be, if you understand like who the threat actors that you actually want to care about, you want to then look at what are the techniques that they're going to use. If you know what those techniques are, the current ones that they're using, you can then look at, okay, so what do I do about that as far as being able to just mitigate those techniques, stop them in their tracks? Or if I can't stop them, at least I can detect them. And so there's particular tools that you will often use to onboard logs from all across the environment to run analytics over to do those detections. So it's basically sort of like shaping up what your threat landscape looks like to then figure out what your defenses should be. That is the idea that we promote and how we want to see the data that we have being used. I will say that we are seeing more uptake at the moment in the private sector than what we are in government. Government, as you say, can be underfunded. Ironically, there are some agencies that have quite large security budgets, but generally speaking, government agencies do not have a huge amount of money to throw around, particularly in sort of the political climate that we find many countries to be in right now. And the government space is also dominated by, I guess, this idea that you don't necessarily want to take a lot of risk. And so let's go with a tried and true vendor that we've been using for years. They may not necessarily be the best, but at least we know them. And government can be relatively loath to change. And so having a new startup coming in and breaking into those fields is not always the easiest thing in the world. But we have had private companies like come to us and say, hey, like we are very interested in your services. So we are seeing more uptake in the private sector at the moment. I would like that to change because I definitely think that the data that we collect does show that governments do come under quite a large amount of scrutiny from threat actors. There is a lot of scrutiny that's also placed on the private sector as well. And so it's an interesting one as far as how much different people willing to value their security and sort of put their money where their mouth is. It is with the private sector at the moment, but we'd like to see that change.
I want to change directions only slightly, though, really, because I do think that this is really a question that the answer might be able to be addressed towards the people in government, towards the people in private sector, for what you think will help them engage more with this kind of work on a personal level. So I remember you said that one of your gateways was Mozilla, and these spaces can kind of be a little echo chambery. You're talking to people that are very interested in the same things, and it's very encouraging space, which is fantastic that it exists. I'm wondering what you think we need in the open source space and for the kind of work that you're doing. What other things or more things like those spaces, or what different things do we need in order to make it more sustainable, what you're doing, what you're trying to put forward around security and open source, for perhaps the people that, again, aren't already bought in and aren't already in those echo chambers? What other things can we do to make this more sustainable on a community level?
Looking back on my personal experience, so I've worked in government and I've also done a lot of open source work. And the times that I have been in government, I have gotten questions being like, you do all this open source work? Isn't that activism? That seems to be quite anti what we're doing. And then conversely, when I have been in open source spaces, they're like, you work in government, should we trust you? Why are you here? So I've actually personally had this interesting issue where I have found myself feeling out of place in both spaces, and trying to bridge those two worlds is not always the easiest thing. And it's not easy for very, very good reasons. A lot of times you have open source groups that are looking at these big companies and they're saying, well, you are literally just extracting from this ecosystem. How do we even start to engage in any sort of discussion when we are not sure that discussions are in good faith? Conversely, I do know very much from personal experience that quite often it is very much just a lack of understanding from the private sector as far as actually what goes into open source and why people contribute to it and why it exists and why people do what they do around it. So I feel like the glib answer is well, how do you start to do more things to sort of get these two worlds to talk together? I think we need to start looking at the capitalist system and figuring out who are the winners, who are the losers, and how do we get to a more equitable system? And that's not something that's going to get solved on this podcast. I guess as far as something practical that people can have a look at from the work that I have done myself, I think it's really good that I have been in government spaces and had some questions around some of the work that I've been interested in, but I've always been able to explain, this is what I do and this is why I do it. And this is how I actually think that it aligns with your interests. And I think that if there's more of us willing to have people from open source sort of come into spaces where people from are not traditionally found, be they large corporations, be they government, that kind of stuff, and having people from government and big business being in these open source spaces, I think that cross-pollination is only going to lead to more understanding from both sides and less polarity from both sides.
The largest inroads I've seen towards those conversations have been around digital sovereignty in general, where you have major governments now talking about setting up multi-million-dollar funds to either support open source or support moving off of the Microsoft, Google, American stack for obvious reasons. Digital sovereignty is interesting. My problem with it is that it sort of has every single country build themselves an island, and open source doesn't necessarily respect boundaries. It's kind of, you can use it here, you can use it there. And I'm curious about your thoughts on that. Do you think that that would be a good way to start having those conversations? Or do you see other means of having corporate open source government trifecta coming together?
I think these are worthy discussions. I do think that we need to be careful around them, though. As you point out, having everyone build their own island is not necessarily the best way to go about doing things. One of the things that Mozilla very much hammered home to me was the idea of a splinternet, where you have multiple internets where you cannot search across them because people have their own little private internets. The internet is the world's largest shared resource. And if we fragment that and start to carve that up, it becomes a lot less useful very, very quickly. And I think technology in general does play along those lines. I think it's good that we do have discussions around moving away from the centralization we see with some of these large players. I don't think centralization is necessarily your answer. Fragmentation taken to its extreme also is not great. The thing that I worry about with these discussions is that coming from a very parochial, nationalistic brand, as far as we are going to do this for the sovereignty of our nation, and the motivations behind it are not always the most kind, is the nicest way to put it. Again, I won't sort of go into names, but there's particular countries that are very aggressively either cutting themselves off from the internet and having sort of their own internet and then their own sort of technical ecosystem. There are other countries that have kind of had that forced upon them through sanctions and various means. And having these countries build things in isolation where they can build an echo chamber around these nationalist ideas, I don't think it takes us to a good place. But I don't think that's to say that we should like then centralize in like some very, very big players that are just extracting from the ecosystem and making huge amounts of money. I think the answer lies somewhere in the middle. Where that is, I think, is a discussion that countries down to communities, down to individuals need to have and figure out where that line is for them.
Well, that's a great resounding clarifying call. There's been a standard joke, which I've had for the past few years, that all conversations on this podcast end up with capitalism is hard and everything is like multifaceted and I don't know how to solve it.
I make no promises to give anyone silver bullets. So
I'm just going to say thank you. Kade, where can we learn more about your thoughts online? Do you have a blog? Is there a website for Arachne Digital, etc.?
They can find Arachne Digital at www.arachne.digital. I write on our Medium blog, so you can find that at medium.com/@Arachne Digital. You can primarily come and join our GitHub repository. So you can find us at github.com/Arachne-threat-intel.
Cool. I am sensing a theme. And you can also find all of those in the show notes. Thanks so much for providing them, Kade. You can go to podcast.sustainoss.org to find those notes as always. Kade, this has been a really, really cool conversation. It's interesting to talk to someone starting a small shop doing this, because I think you just learn more. I feel like you're more in the weeds, more in the field, more, I don't know, in the thick of it. That's the one I was going for. So thanks so much for sharing. Don't leave yet, though. At the end of every podcast, we have Spotlight, which is basically a massive shout out to Eric Berry for getting us on this train. And we just point out other people's projects or things that we think need a little bit of light shed on them. Eriol Fox, as the co-host, you have to go first. What is your spotlight today?
A little self-serving, but we all like a little bit of relevant self-serving on the podcast. I'd love to spotlight some work that I did over the last few years on a repository, which you can find Superbloom, but SPRBLM/The Design We Open. This is a big project. We just published a report, a big document, I think late last year, early this year. And a lot of it was about involving designers in Taiwan around internet shutdown topics and open source. So we did that at COSCUP. So it's a repository of all the things that we've done around design, security, internet shutdowns at COSCUP over 2023 and 2024. So I kind of feel like on the theme of security and internet freedom, very relevant.
Very important work.
Cool. Thank you so much, Eriol. That sounds great. I want to give a shout out to 1Password and also Robin Riley for pointing out that 1Password has an open source program where if you do open source and you have like a Teams account, they'll just give it to you for like free. You have to apply using a GitHub issue, but that's awesome. They will make you switch to a Teams account, which then will charge you. And then they may take a few days to give you that, which they haven't done for me yet. So right now I'm just being charged. But as a matter of faith, I'm saying that 1Password will come through for me. It has come through for other people. And I'm just really chuffed by that because I don't use 1Password. Why would I say that publicly on the air? That's a stupid idea on a security podcast. But if I did, I'd be really happy. So that's great. All right. I'm a bad liar. Kade, what's your spotlight today?
I'm going to be slightly greedy and have a few shout outs. So I want to shout out in general the work that MITRE does. MITRE put out a lot of different various sort of open source projects. Tram is one of them. Literally, we forked it and made an entire business around it. So I want to give a shout out to MITRE. They do very, very good work for the security industry globally, and then the work that security industry is sort of doing for people globally. Like, I think MITRE is definitely like an organization that is worth sort of shouting out. I also want to give a shout out to a gentleman called Justin Seat. He wrote this little blog post that I don't even think is online anymore. It was some years back that was looking at a Python project that was using a project called Cirx, which is a meta search engine. So it's a search engine of search engines. And basically what you do is you would give it keywords and Cirx would go out and basically do research for you. And again, it's part of what we ended up building a business around. And I reached out to Justin some years back. Justin probably will not remember this, but he was the most patient man with my semi-technical questions around trying to get all this open source stuff to work. As far as open source projects and being inviting and having people come into these spaces, that was just one interaction that was just absolutely amazing and will stick with me for the rest of my life. So Justin Seats is my shout out.
I've had one person in the past 6 months do the very similar thing where I put them on to my cousin who needs some help with editing some files. And he went way over the top to help her. And it was like extraordinary. And she wrote me like a tearful email of thanks. And that was our editor, Paul, who I think just deserves a spotlight every episode because without him, this wouldn't happen. So just shout out to Paul again, if I could have a second one. I love people like that. Thank you, Kade, for sharing one here. Those are the best people. And thank you so much for coming on. Listeners, you also came on this journey with us. Thank you for joining us on this podcast today. If you have enjoyed this podcast, there are many things you can do, many. So one, hug a maintainer near you if they consent to being hugged. Go out of your way to make sure that they feel loved today. That'd be really, really dope. Two, you can go to podcast@saintoss.org and look at the show notes. Check out Kade's links. Go check out Arachne Digital. It'd be really, really awesome. Also, three, share the podcast. If you enjoy this, talk about it elsewhere. Word of mouth is where it's at. And if you are really cool, share it with people who have large wallets because we are strapped for cash at the moment. So we have 4 of these Maintainer Month podcasts coming out over the next month or so. More about it's going to be kind of a loose May area. So listen to those. And after that, if your company would like to sponsor this podcast, do get in touch. You can email podcast@saintoss.org or just richard@saintoss.org. That also goes to me. And that'd be really, really cool. You can find us on all the socials except the evil ones, which means basically just Mastodon and Blue Sky, and that's okay too. And thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. Kade, thank you so much for coming on. Really, really cool. Hope to see you around. Keep it up.
Thank you for having me. This has been amazing.